Hello and good evening, everybody. I'm your host, Joshua Void, and tonight we're going to have a fantastic discussion. We're actually going to be talking about Marxism and really the implications that are within Marxism or the problems within Marxism, talking about the theories in and of themselves that are within Marxist thought and how they don't necessarily correlate or coalesce into something that would be beneficial within a market strategy, or even if we look at it on a ordinary level, in a sense, how it's unable well, maybe not answer, because a lot of concepts aren't based on answering, but it's more based on what it can give to people. What is the benefit that it can give to people? And there's implications in that as well. So we're going to delve into the full entire cake of Marxism tonight. But before we do that, I do want to thank everybody who's within the comments section right now. Thank you so much, Linear, for being here. And thank you so much for producer Wes for being here. It is always a pleasure to have both of you and anybody else who's listening into this conversation right now. Thank you for being here. The other thing that I want to say is thank you very much for our patron supporters, Linear and TART, for helping us do what we love doing, which is getting information out to awesome viewers as yourself. And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce a friend of mine, a good friend of mine, Christopher Stum, into the Atheist Uprising. How are you doing, Christopher? How is your night so far?
I believe I'm well. I'll apologize in advance. I usually show my face, but today I incurred a surprise contact dermatitis to my face, so I will not be showing my face this day.
Understandable.
From Neosporin, topical Neosporin, combined with a bandage and sleeping on that side of my face, believe it or not.
Wow. Yeah. But it's okay. It's okay, because today we're getting into the substance. So it's all right that we don't show our faces, because at this very moment, I heard a lot. Yes, Linear has heard a lot of good things about you, Christopher. A lot of good things. So without any further ado, Marxism.
Oh, fuck me. It's fitting that the video that I start, that I predicate this entry to this channel on is of or pertaining to Marxism, isn't it?
Right.
Well,
right.
I suppose for those unacquainted, my specialties are in theoretical physics, pure mathematics. In the physics, it's Einstein's field equations, photonics, and quantum mechanics. And in pure mathematics, it's in foundational proofing. And then formal logic. I graduated with highest honors in Chapel Hill while triple majoring, and now I currently teach college math and physics at the College of Eastern Idaho. And that's pretty much, I'm taking a gap year before proceeding to my PhD in either theoretical physics or pure mathematics. This is a brief overview. So it's kind of weird that we're talking about Marx, but it's really because from a pure, when I say pure logic, I really mean from a foundational perspective and from a mathematical perspective. I believe I have non-trivial contributions to make. But moreover, throughout my education, I did take the time to kind of dip my feet into a repository of subjects, two of which were macro and microeconomics, differential equations-based economics. And so the mathematics can be very grounding, and you learn very quickly, especially through association with the repository professors with whom I have good relations. What theories are currently on the forefront of the field of economics? Which ones are doing the lifting? Which ones are really making the substantive advances and that are reached for as tools to solve open problems in economics? And which ones are kind of just they are proliferating in the humanities, not really considered a science, so to speak, and they're not, and Marxism is definitely in that category beyond reasonable doubt. I know a few economists who are good friends of mine who have made modifications to the foundations of Marxism to some degree of success, but almost always the modifications are such that it coheres with existent mathematical theorems and game theoretic convergencies from Nash equilibria.
I would completely agree with that. I think that when we really look into the idea of Marxism, at first, when you see it on paper, it makes it really seem like there is something that has some sort of potential value for individuals and for societies in and of themselves. But once we really start getting into the actual rigor of the subject and taking it apart, you slowly start to see that there's many holes within the Marxist ideology that can't necessarily, unless you reform it in a way or you change it in certain aspects, and even then you run into issues. It doesn't seem to work within our current models so far.
I would conjecture that Marxism, as classically defined, because it should be made a concession that there exists a repository of takes on Marxism separate from Das Kapital and his own contributions, right? Many spinoffs. They're more fairly, I think, defined as theories that have explanatory capability, but they're not scientific theories in the sense that while they may offer explanatory capability, they have completely failed in most regards to provide predictive capability. And that's the important part. Test, retest, variance, falsifiability, and really predictive capability, not just explanatory capacity. And by, and that those are some of the hallmarks that define a scientific theory. It has to be able to make predictions. And unfortunately, Marxism struggles in that regard. But I'd say, it's not tenable for us to really unpack all of Marxism in short order, even in many years. But that depth and complexity doesn't necessarily imply profundity. I mean, even bullshit, as it turns out, can be extremely complicated. Just get a degree in theology. So I think that what would be most prudent to begin with are just the axioms that kind of, and when I say axioms, we'll start with vague conceptual foundations, not the specific set of axioms, just to be emphatically clear. So we're assuming a first order classical Boolean system of logic. So first order predicate logic. That's the foundation on which Marxism is defined. And so let that kind of be in the background. We're not talking about a system of logic of RDN or anything like that. And maybe you would give a more fair and succinct summation. I don't want to confuse people out the gate, and then we'll dive into more detail. Is that sufficient for you?
Absolutely. I think that's a great way of looking at it, because I think Marxism works extremely well within the abstract ideas that it sends out, in a sense. And it kind of hits on individuals' emotions and stuff. So I think when we look at when we look at Marxism in and of itself, we need to look at the original founders, which are Marx and Engels, for instance, and the way that they took on the idea of what would be beneficial within society and how society can run in a proper manner, but fair, or not fair, but have a sense of equality for all. And when we really look at it, because Marxism was that transitionary phase towards communism. So when we really look at Marxism, what we can really start calling forward. Thank you. I won't. So beforehand, what we can really jump into is really look at the four sort of hypotheses, or at least postulates, that Marx had come up with. The first one was predominantly based on revolution. That was the first big initial push in order to change the surrounding environment to the betterment of the new proletariat, in a sense. But then when you start breaking it down even more after the revolution has come, then after it was based on also and now I forget the terminology of this. So
dialectical materialism, I think,
exactly, right? Dialectical materialism. And when we really look into dialectical materialism, what we can really see is the idea about concepts somehow becoming at least towards my understanding, the concepts that individuals have within their head somehow becoming a material essence, in a sense, like coming into fruition through the concepts that we have within our heads. But I think,
I think to give people a bird's eye introductory view into dialectic materialism, it should be conceptualized as a distinction between abstract thought and concrete thought. And the abstraction is actually, in this case, reversed from being the pinnacle of thinking in rigor and profundity to rather the starting basis or something something lesser than what Marx referred to as a concrete thought. And it wasn't per se Marx himself. These two philosophies are intertwined both in their development and publication. So it's unclear who specifically per se thought what succinctly from one another. But so the idea is that we move from abstraction to concretization. That is to be more concrete. And to think of something concrete is to think of it, if we're thinking about facts, I mean, they didn't thoroughly define rigorously what facts meant, but they thought of like abstract thought as just thinking of facts in isolation, whereas concrete thought is the coherence of facts in contextualization to the things that contain them and the things that comprise them, and how they're biconditional, emergent, and profound relations that lead to dynamicism between what a thing is, what comprises it, and what contains it. And so this idea is really, concretization can be thought of as coherence, and true knowledge arrived at through concretization, which isn't a term they use, but rather that's the idea. It's thinking in materialist sense, coherence from abstraction, to make a thought comport with whatever ontologically we would think exists, is to really cohere from isolation of facts to contextualization of their history, their environment, what contains them, and what comprises them in that sense.
Right, exactly. It's a very good way of putting it. So when we really look at Marxism within that light in and of itself, we can slowly but surely start to see that there are already difficulties within that said system, in a sense, but we don't necessarily need to delve into the difficulties as of yet.
I would say just like on a prima facie level, some of the superficial concerns, just since it's predicated on a binary system of logic, would be, it's not very difficult to separate emergent relations from what you would think of as like their basis of from which they emerge. So an analogy I often give to help people conceptualize, say, quantum mechanics would be, if you think of on the level of a single die, if it's a quote unquote fair die, which is kind of a terrible analogy because the system is defining and kind of allowing the die to behave in the way you would define it to be. But, if you define a fair die, then the probability of, any nth side for a die of n sides is 1 over n, as you have asymptotically many trials. And so I suppose what I mean to say is on the level of a single die, we have invariability then in probability. That is, the probability for any nth side is 1 over n for that die. But if you take, say, at least 2 of them and you sum over what you can get from those die rolls. So let's say I want snake eyes. There's one and only one, in a Boolean system of logic and in the assumed sample space outcome that satisfies that, right? That's to get a sum of 2. Whereas if I want, say, a 4, I can have 2 2s, or I can have a 1 and a 3. And so from the basis of invariable probability, kind of just falls out variability, but it's not turtles all the way down. These things are clearly separable and not necessarily, they have a coherence of sorts, but at the same time, there's a distinction that if you're following, coherence, if you're looking for turtles all the way down, as the saying would go, you would be understandably confused. And so one of the challenges with this materialist theory, this philosophy of science, is just on superficial levels of examination, such as in this analogy, it can be rather challenging to cohere concepts without just making arbitrary relations. But at the same token, since it's all predicated fundamentally on first order classical Boolean logic, if you're using classical axiomatic set theory, you're going to run into like Cantor's theorem, where there's no set of all sets. And so if you try to put everything in the set of things that can be cohered in this way, if there are infinitely many things or arbitrarily large like cardinalities, you'll run into a problem, a contradiction, basically, where there will exist at least one element not in the set of elements beholden to this property.
Huh. Interesting. So I'm guessing, so what you're trying to say is that already through certain systems that are out there, it is very hard for us to look at something through dialectical materialism, in a sense, because we're looking at the things through we're looking at concepts to concrete thoughts, in a sense, but in and of themselves, these two aspects are very difficult to assimilate. towards a certain extent. If I'm
it's more so that even, I mean that's a, I suppose what I'm trying to say is it's also further complicated by the observation that these terms are just insufficiently well defined. It's very much like when you say something is a material theory, or a physicalism, almost all the theoretical physics, in fact, all the theoretical physics that I've learned, the word physical is just not used. It may not even be a meaningful term. And the fact that we add a word physical and then make the distinction of its negation for the set of all things we define physical to mean doesn't necessarily mean that those symbols map to a non-empty set. It's not clear. It may not even be a meaningful distinction, so it's very difficult, especially when you're thinking metaphysically, to give an adequate and complete, a comprehensive criticism, but at the same time, to demonstrate the generality, because the definition is not what logicians would call effectively decidable. So an effectively decidable set, as classified in like axiomatic set theory, would be a set in which there exists for any element in the set and that set itself, thus a membership function. So, for example, and usually the membership function has the properties 1 if something belongs to the set. So you apply the function operating on the element. And if it belongs to the set, the output is 1, if and only if it's in the set, and 0 otherwise. So if, let's say we're operating on the set of natural numbers, and we want to know if something belongs to the set of even numbers. So we apply an operator. Well, if it belongs to an even number, the definition is if x is even, there exists an n in Z such that 2n equals x, right? So we should find a multiple of 2 times some integer n, positive or not, depending on if it's negative or positive, that will basically have a product equal to this number. And so we can therefore divide that out, and that quotient should be equal to 1. And so we have a now well-defined membership function for any integer that we can operate on that integer, and it will be 1 or 0. It'll be 1 if and only if it's even, and 0 otherwise. And so that's an example of an effectively decidable set. And we don't, with these definitions, really have in first order classical Boolean logic a way to make, with using primitive recursive relations and building up more complex function structures, a way to make these sets effectively decidable. And so that's problematic, because then defining something is not in or out of the set. Therefore, yes or no, it doesn't comport with this theory. That is, these sets of axioms, these sets of postulates is exceedingly difficult to actually logically demonstrate. It would take a very long time. It would be extremely
interesting. Okay, so what you're trying to say is that there must be much more rigor going into the set equation, rather than just saying that we've already reached a destination, in a sense. Like, there needs to be much more research involved within the said theories, which are within either Marxism or any type of said, how could I say it? Within any said economic said system. And from there, we need to really go deep down within it and try to see if it actually makes sense to put that system into place.
I'm not sure, because even some concepts that are sensible may be emergent and not fundamental. I very much like, if I give you an analogy, like the notion of surface tension at the level of a single molecule of H2O, the notion of surface tension doesn't make sense. And so some things, I'm using scale here in air quotes kind of as an analogy, but some things you may not be able to reduce them to, they may not necessarily have the requisite properties. But I suppose fundamentally, I'm not sure what I am trying to say, to be emphatically clear. But dialectical materialism, I can tell you, has never in all of my study of theoretical physics been anything we've ever reached for, to do theoretical physics.
Interesting. So in a sense, it's kind of like we are shining a light in a particular area where in that area, my apologies, where in that area, it seems that we're looking in the wrong direction. Because
this is why I preface this conversation with the distinction between explanatory capacity and predictive capability. My question would be, what are we able to predict with this modus operandum, as it were, this notion? of and that's where these kind of indulgences into armchair philosophy usually fall on their face, is when you try to apply them. And that's not to say everything should be reduced to science. That would be, I'm not trying to say that at all. I'm just observing that the reason we are really talking about science is, at the end of the day, we're talking about human behaviors, and we're trying to make predictions about human behavior on small and large scales. And so that's where it comes into the economics of the situation, which isn't, of course, exclusive to humans.
No, I would completely agree. When you look at economics, or if you're looking at the way that a system is able to actually produce something, whatever that thing may be, we can look even in chimpanzee populations, for instance, and look at the instances where they themselves have this kind of way with working with each other in order to take down something. But the economic cost for that, in a sense, would be their energy in order to taking down that said animal that has come into their territory, or that they are hunting down in the first place. And then you can take that on a macro scale into where we're at today with monetary funds and dollar cost averages and so on and so forth, and make it much more intricate, but in and of itself is kind of like the same as I think that we would see within these.
It's also just that we don't even necessarily have evidence in physics that all things necessarily cohere in a way that you would even conceptualize as causation. Causation is not fundamental in physics. And so the very notion of sequence, of order, of discreteness may be emergent and not fundamental, as well as space-time. And so those are fundamentally open questions in theoretical physics, but they're non-trivial. And they're not just I guess what I would say is moving forward, I think, to make this a little more concrete for listeners, I just mentioned this materialist theory, really to motivate some of the foundations through which Marxism is viewed. But to perhaps concretize the discussion, I suppose, pun intended, it may be useful to move on to like the theory of labor value, right? And how this is an alternative to notions of like supply and demand.
Right. I would completely agree with that, because I think what's really good is tackling each and every kind of avenue that I was about to say materialism. Whoops. That Marxism kind of puts in front of us. And just like how you stated, even though that causation in and of itself seems to be problematic, because even in physics, that aspect of causation doesn't necessarily seem to be there, or it's extremely hard to define what causes what if we really look at the intricacies.
It's not even that it's hard to define. What I mean is that
it's non-existent.
The very notion of an ontology. The word non-existent may not be adequate, because I'm talking to you in a Boolean first-order predicate system of logic, but there are other systems of logic that are sometimes used to study quantum mechanics. And so I can't tell you in English, being a first-order predicate Boolean logic based language. And there is. It doesn't make any sense when you structure the propositions together. So maybe what I would say is, if we're thinking on the scale, though, if even microeconomics, we're not at the level of quarks and leptons. We're thinking well above the level of protons and neutrons, electrons. We're really looking at things the size of pairs, et cetera, et cetera. And so the physics, in that sense, maybe there's an emergent ontology. And so maybe we can get away in a fixed reference frame, thinking in that sense. But what I'd say is, like with labor value theory, again, if we ask what's its predictive capability, we run into issues very quickly, even if we try to come up with a simple example of like a pizza shop. Okay, and we discussed this before a while ago, right? It was this notion of how are we going to run the shop, and what defines the point at which we cease in production. And this is ignoring, of course, a neurological, behavioral perspective, right? We're not looking at phenotypic expression of organisms, emergent, et cetera, et cetera. And if we ask, well, if the value from the production of pizzas is put into that product via the labor, why do we stop producing pizzas? proportionately to
I see what you're saying. Okay.
expected consumption. Meaning, why is it the case that we often end up in situations where, and this is independent of who has the means of production, right? Even if we own this shop together, if we don't want to waste dough or waste raw materials, I mean, but you notice that what's being snuck in the back here, or as we are from looking at the like foundations of the game theoretic implications, we are assuming a set of motivations, right? That we don't want to waste dough, etc. I don't know how you can avoid that, but what I'm getting at is, why do we often observe that? Let's say we determine on average, or statistically speaking, every pizza past the 15th pizza is just going to be wasted dough. So we don't produce that pizza. If a labor value theory, really had predictive capability, what behavior would it predict? Would it predict that we continue or don't discontinue production? But moreover, how does it even explain at the explanatory level why we cease? Because obviously Marx, the reason I brought up incoherence of concepts is it's not in the flavor of Marxism to look at that behavior in isolation, devoid of contextualization. And so he would like to contextualize that, right? But how do we contextualize and cohere that with the theory that the labor is what's adding the value, defining not only the amount we produce, but the price we set? Why do we stop production?
Okay. So what we're looking at is something a little more fundamental than
Well,
just.
all right, I should correct myself. Not only why do we stop production, but why do we stop at a certain price? Why do we not keep raising the price of the pizza to $1 million, $1,000, $1,000 million? Why do we also stop at a certain price, and why do we stop in quantity of production at a certain number of units produced?
Very good question. Because creating above that, or raising your price above, as you stated, the $100 million or the $1,000 million will then make it almost unaffordable for anybody else at the bottom tier to pay for, in a sense. So it needs to go where the what is it called again? Where inflation lies, in a sense, so that people can afford to actually buy that pizza, and there's going to be a profit from it.
Well, just to be emphatically clear, there's a fundamental philosophical distinction between inflation and the phenomenon I'm discussing, right? And I'm not saying you said otherwise. I just want that to be emphatically clear. In fact, inflation in some instances can be a good thing. It's a complex. It's not merely, most people characterize it as the increase in price over time required to buy a particular good. It's not that simple. It's actually a complex emergent relationship between that, the quantity supplied of a given object and it's all within a certain contextualization of a defined period of time, usually a local, so a shorter period of time, but not necessarily, but also in proportion to an existent population of individuals. And so we actually need the U.S. government, the Federal Reserve Bank, we plan to have a certain amount of inflation every year, about 2.4%, 2.41, I don't know the exact percentage. And it's because if you have a fixed supply of money, you actually run into problems if and when your population grows, right? Because but you also don't want to devalue the currency. But again, and I'm getting off topic. I just want that distinction to be emphatically clear. It's an entirely different rabbit hole we could go down. But back to discussing this idea of Marx's notion of labor value theory. How does that theory explain that behavior, but on such a scale as to be consistent across a repository of times, meaning multiple throughout history? This behavior is pretty well documented, but also across multiple cultures in the world today. How does it predict that behavior? How does it explain the behavior? How does it?
That's actually a pretty good question. And what I would state is that it explains that behavior through its materialistic prospects, in a sense, and let alone through its other ideal, which is predominantly its sense of making everything equal, or heading towards some sort of sense of equality, in a sense. So where I would see where their idea originates is to say, what can we do in order to make things more equal for the lower rung of society? And I think
I would say what's intriguing to me is when you study differential equations based economics, the foundations can differ in their conceptual motivations, meaning you don't even need to go to like supply and demand, because obviously what's being hinted at is like demand, not just supply. But you honestly don't even need to think in terms of demand and supply. You could think from the perspective of like maybe evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biology. You could imagine that there exists an external set of stimuli for which there is successive approximation convergent upon a dopaminergically incentivized reward incentive.
Absolutely.
So you don't even, and that's what one of the interesting things is that because of that, a repository of evolutionary phenomena are actually modeled in differential equations based economics.
No, that is very interesting.
They've actually done a lot of research in which because in a sense, sometimes functionally speaking, the reasons for which a phenomenon can emerge may be different, but result in similar sets of mathematical equations. We may call it supply demand, but it could also just be, convergence asymptotically through various selection pressures, not only natural selection over time to external stimulus rewards, and I guess again, my question would be, how would a labor value theory address, that's only one question. I mean, the questions we can entertain would be many, but I think this is one. It's not the only, right? Because another problem that we would have to entertain is like, how do we explain behaviors in which we do not see exchanges, not only in early modern hominids, but just in everyday life of humans, right? Why do we not see Joshua going out? Well, here's perhaps a more damning criticism is, if labor adds value, then why is it that the very alleged perpetrator of the I guess you could say the robbery, and I don't mean literally because it would be disingenuous to say that Marx was, calling capitalists robbers. But what I'm saying is, if they were essentially undervaluing the labor, then how is it that labor is adding the value? Because if it depends on their perception of the value to create the problem that exists, well, we've just put ourselves in a pickle now, haven't we? Because we're implicitly conceding a supply from and demand relationship from the perspective of the supply chain, insofar as it's of or pertaining to employment.
Right, exactly. And henceforth, it would actually cause a problem, because already there's this implication that's being put forward, if I'm understanding you correctly, that the idea that the worker in and of themselves is put within that position could actually be an emergent process in and of itself, so that you have certain individuals that are maybe quote unquote in the right place at the right time, and other individuals, sadly, that are not. And henceforth, these differing or divergent areas within the economy, and plus supply and demand, and the worker, and let alone that.
I guess to put it very simply, I'd put it this way: if your value from your product was bequeathed by your labor, and of course this is complex because what kind of value are we talking about? But if we mean the kind of value that like has anything to do with price, how are you underpaid? Because then we're pointing to me, your employer, for not paying you enough. But if that problem exists, are we not making an implicit concession? So we have to say that the person employing you is dishonest. We can't say that they undervalue or value it differently per se. It's not a direct contradiction, but it's dangerously, perilously close. And the more specific we get, the more formal and well-defined the mathematical terms become, the more we risk, in addition to the previous concern, motivated, right? Getting ourselves into quite the bind here. Because if we're trying to say, no, it's my labor that's setting the price and putting the value in this product, in whatever mathematical way we mean to reconcile that with, we also have to reconcile how it is the case then that if other people are not defining per their demand curves, not just for my labor, but for the very product I'm producing, which is also, by the way, the product you're setting in terms of revenue as the person that employs me. In order for us to reconcile all of this, we have to basically obfuscate away from the possibility that it's because you can value the product differently apart from my labor.
Okay. I'm seeing the gist at the moment. Okay.
I'd also ask, could you put value of labor into labor? Does it have like a knock-on effect where you can put labor into your labor, increasing the value of your labor tenfold, right? Or 20, you know what I'm saying? Like, can you put labor into labor? Like, what is a product and what is labor, and how are they distinguishable as well? These terms do not seem adequately well defined. And the
Right.
more the weeds we get, again, and this also goes back to effective decidability. Do we have rigorous mathematical apparatuses capable of withstanding? Because this and these difficulties in and again, I guess here's a pun, concretization. They're not just in Marxist ideologies. They do also exist and are currently open problems in economics. In mainstream economics, in modern economics, one big set of problems are those of or pertaining to externalities. Uh, the notion that if you pay a musician, that you've paid for, say, a private good or a service, but someone walks by and has the benefit of that transaction. That externality makes the calculation rather complicated when you start to get down to brass tacks. And that may seem like an innocuous problem, but when you're really getting down into the weeds, that's also so these problems are not, and I want to emphasize that just to make it emphatically clear. I'm not saying that problems economically, conceptually only exist for Marxism, but rather that I think these challenges,
Like they're within every system in a sense.
well, the specific things I motivated, I think, are particular to Marxism in the sense
Right.
that it's going to be very difficult for us to get off the ground with labor theory of value, because just forget about supply and demand. Just look at it from a perspective of evolutionary biology. How
Yeah.
are we? What? How do we have we would have to basically have non-trivial empirical evidence of the emergence of. See, what I'm trying to say is that you notice it's much harder to draw a parallel between Marxism with labor value theory and supply and demand functions of or pertaining to the emergent relations between an organism and its ecosystem, its environment.
Yeah. Yeah, that is very true. And I think the
Because what represents the organism's environment here? What is the because you notice that in the case of supply and demand, we don't even necessarily need to have a value theory on top of that or underneath it. We can literally just define this as asymptotic convergence of
right.
via phenotypic expressions via successive approximation to externalities with stimulus reward based on dopaminergic incentivation, melatonin modulation, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. I agree, and henceforth that there will be certain things that the Marxist ideology, and definitely when it comes towards the economy, and definitely when it comes towards uh, why do I keep forgetting these terms? The
Dialectics.
demand and supply, or not demand and supply, but the way that demand. Well, no, that is not at all
Do you
what
mean
is it.
do you mean to speak about, like, say, emergent relations that we observe in biology, like specialization according to comparative
Yes, yes, thank you.
So, like,
Jeez.
if you have in economics, for those who don't know, something called a production possibility frontier, and it's basically if you assume a finite amount of resources, then there exists some amount of any particular good or service you could conceivably produce within a fixed time t, and if you have, say, n number of products in juxtaposition in n-dimensional space, it forms a closed curve. Closed because you have a finite amount of resources, and it's often curved, usually not linear, because the parts eventually at some point become mutually exclusive. So if you have, like, say, XY axis and you're making trucks and tanks, as you get better at tank parts because they have treads, you're getting less efficient at truck parts and vice versa. And this is down
Right.
to maximization of marginal benefit in relation to marginal cost. Marginal benefit usually has a logarithmic diminishing returns. There's marginal cost is exponential. If I said marginal, I meant marginal benefit. So in case I said that wrong, marginal benefit is logarithmic diminishing returns, and marginal cost is exponential rise, and they cross at a point and usually do something up to that point. And so as this relates back to production possibility frontiers, is there's two things. If you imagine firms, but this could also, again, which is fascinating, be interchangeable with organisms as just things that produce some output, which isn't necessarily a service, or a product, but it could also be literally some efficient production of, like, say, the egg and sperm between species. Anyway, I just read a comment and kind of broke my chain of thought. But anyway, so if you have phenotypic expressions that can be modeled in this way by production possibility frontiers, something interesting is there are two types of advantages. There's the absolute advantage, which is the amount that can be produced, and there's the comparative advantage, which is really it's the derivative of that function. It's per unit produced who's more efficient. And one thing that's pretty well established is in many cases, under the right set of conditions, of course, that's usually always the case, because again, many things are emergent and not fundamental. And that kind of defines a certain, just like water tension, right? You're assuming certain properties for it to be in a liquid state and a certain scale and a certain mass and gravity field, et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of a concession, even baked into the axiomatic logic. But anyway, if at least two things produce only according to their comparative advantage, then they can, if they exchange after production, they can hit a point in that exchange of what they acquire in that n tuple of goods they've exchanged, in this case, a two tuple for two firms, a point outside of any one of their production possibility frontiers. And so this pattern plays out across a myriad of disciplines and fields. That's why in hospitals, everybody specializes in one and usually only one thing. That's why in academia, everybody specializes. You do, this person does physics, this person does anatomy, this person does Marxism, et cetera, because then by specializing according to those comparative advantages, we hit a point outside of any singular person's production possibility frontier. And those phenomena emerge even outside of that. They occur in nature, like with the production of egg and sperm. It's partly why you can model the divergence of egg and sperm production in asymmetric, in a binary system. Binary, too, because it was the most probable to succeed. A system in which there were free organisms was just less probable over time.
Exactly. That's a very good way of putting it, an extremely good way of putting it. And I think when we really look at the equations in the end, they're just like how you stated, you're going to optimize in a certain area within the economy, and in other areas there's going to be certain individuals that are going to optimize in other areas of the economy. And for the Marxists to look at things kind of like everything is going to be at one point the same is kind of looking at these emergent processes.
Well, I don't think it would be fair to say that's what Marxists would say at all, and I think it's fair to give them adequate representation. But rather, what I'm pointing out is when I get into the weeds of all these systems of equations, it really doesn't coherently point to any simplistic, easily espousable system of economics that you could just point to: capitalism, Marxism, communism.
I think when we look at the transitionary phase of what Marxism is trying to aim for.
Right. If I had to pick, I would be not in the camp of Marxism.
Right, exactly. Because that transitionary phase in and of itself is looking towards the equality of all people. Or
the equity, shall we say the equity, which is more concerning.
Equity would be fine. Yeah,
which is in a sense more concerning, because if you look at this from like a dopaminergic reward incentive perspective, the reward, and we've discussed this previously as well, the reward centers of the brain they're literally neurologically wired separately from the centers of the brain that you would think of as like contentedness. And because of this, if the desire for equity is pursuit oriented versus contented oriented, you're looking at completely different dopaminergic reward incentives, which is concerning, because then it's possible that what is pursued is not fulfilling, literally anatomically, and in that sense, if you don't pick which nervous system or subset of the nervous system, as it were, more correctly, you're trying to, and this would be the primary nervous system, right? You're trying to defer to, then the very notion of equity, it may not be sufficiently well defined to even be anything you could stand on.
That is very true. And I think that in the same sense, where what we would look at too is that everybody has a distinct way of looking at what would be the best system in the sense, even out of the Marxists, because there's plenty of different Marxists out there. that have different ideas based on how to bring about a communistic like system, or try to work on a transitionary system to communism. So if we're really delving into these type of thought processes, we can look at, let's just say, the difference between Marx and Lenin, for instance, or Lenin and Stalin, for instance, or Trotsky and Leninists and Stalinists. And you can continue going down that rabbit hole uh, for almost all the socialists, or Marxists, I should say, that are out there at this very moment, trying to come up with the proper hypotheses, at least, and definitely economic hypotheses, in order to get to that final goal, which is communism.
One thing I would often say for a repository of these goals is when you concretize it and try to axiomatize it to a mathematical system, a model, it makes it much harder to get these arguments off the ground. And not just these arguments, but many arguments. And that's why the arguments that are often reached for are those that are, it's not to say everything reduces to mathematics, but if you're talking about, say, suppose there exists two sets A and B of individuals, N and M, as in moose, number of individuals, and define a relation R between these two sets such that R is the equity function or the equity relation, right? And show that there exists such a relation such that if we have a set S of resources associated with these two sets, that there exists a relation R between A and B and S, that not only, and then here's the question, is it across time, for all time, or just for some time, in which this defined metrizable equity, again, depending on which nervous system or subset of the nervous system you're referring to, because is it pursuit or contentedness oriented? And that's an important distinction, because it may turn out that what we think equity would be, equitable for us, that would be fulfilling or meaningful for us, may not, when we actually have it, matter. But moreover, it's also difficult because if you look at asymmetry in a sense, dopaminergically does a lot of work in the sense that there's a reward incentivation for sustaining a stressful externality, right? There's for an environmental response, for an organism having a response to an externality in the environment, there's often a reward incentive. And if the reward incentive is insufficient, we often observe that in a sufficiently stressful environmental externality, the organism will change behavior or cease with a particular behavior, right?
Exactly.
And so,
and then change into.
And so one of the weird things here is that if the ceiling is too low, so to speak, then the persistence in the face of such externalities may not be adequately rewarded to predict the emergence or continuance of certain behaviors.
I would actually really agree with. And I think that a system cannot be forced onto a populace, because a populace into itself has a plethora of ideas that in and of itself separates those individuals into pockets of other individuals with different ideologies, even within the umbrella term of the ideology which we're talking about, which is Marxism. And hence, there would need to be, at least within the Marxist system, a kind of way of, how could I say, of change over time, which is going to be absolutely almost, I wouldn't say impossible, but very difficult to do, have some sort of inclusionary aspect to it that then can tackle everybody's issues, in a sense, if they're looking at true.
I think, to be fair, I don't think it would be a fair representation of Marxism to say it has to tackle everybody. And you don't mean literally everybody. You mean a non-trivial
No, of course not.
But I would say that maybe a non-trivial point that we have heretofore not addressed is also this notion of seizing the means of production, right? And distributing that amongst the people in a, what would you say, what you would call socialism, right?
Yes.
And what's kind of hidden there, though, and kind of ironic, is people often say Marx transitioned from socialism to a kind of communism, but it wasn't because he wanted to per se. It's because I think his hand was kind of forced, in the sense that how does socialism not, if it's going to be stable, turn into communism? What happens when someone goes, I'm not going to share the means of production? What do you do then? But moreover, back to what I was trying to motivate here with the notion of the acquisition of means of production is going back to this pizza shop, this simple pizza shop. A lot of problems economically are really independent of who has the means of production. And it may change who has a say, but it really doesn't necessarily change the problems we face and the conclusions we'd reach. So, for example, in this pizza shop, if we determined that, if we're trying to achieve efficiency, again, even if it's all of our pizza shop, in productive output, given the population, like we're trying to feed, maybe it's not a pizza shop, some manufacturing facility for food where we're trying to feed the population. We're trying to be efficient and not wasteful. So we determine that mathematically, we work out that there's some maximum output per unit time, and thus some maximum number of workers per unit time. Well, then we have an issue of like, even if it's all of our factory, do we hold that efficiency in production as the deciding factor? And if we do, then somebody can't be in this shop at the same time because it's going to impede productive flow, or somebody has to make the concession that they're not going to use that factory to make more, lest it be statistically wasteful, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's that problem, while it is in a sense, things clearly change if we share the means of production, but it's not even emphatically clear that that's for the betterment per se, because while you could argue again that it's harder for us to be exploited in our labor, if you're going back to the dopaminergic reward incentive, who is going to opt into a system of external stress without adequate reward potentiality? But moreover, right? So one of the things we're concerned with is destroying potential for how do we know that people, even if they shared all means of production, under external stresses, which we see in studies with chimpanzees, with bonobos, wouldn't just opt out of the behaviors associated with the external stresses because there's insufficient dopaminergic reward incentive for those behaviors. And meaning, even if we had a Marxist system, for all we know, what would be underneath it, even though it's like a mesh on top of it, would fall out inequalities, inequity, and in outcome. I'm trying to distinguish outcome for equity. It's probably not the best verbiage to do so, but I believe people are following the analogy I'm trying to
Oh
paint.
no, I'm definitely seeing what you're trying to put down.
Now these are questions, of course, but there's that, but then there's the issue of like there exist a repository of problems that are in many ways not emphatically it's not emphatically clear they're related to who has the means of production, but even when we share them, there may be inefficiency in the capability for us. Sometimes what we want done is not a matter of equity, but it could serve equity. So like if there's a hurricane, do we care that FEMA allows equity for participation in its program, or do we care that the people with the best means and the fastest means of addressing the disaster get on the ground and address that? Because those two things may not mathematically comport.
Right. No, I see it. It's because it's very difficult in a sense to kind of see what would be the best system, and anybody who's stating that there is a particular best system is kind of already at the conclusion and still hasn't necessarily looked at the not the math, but hasn't looked at the equations as of yet in order to really see which system actually works. Or actually, what should be stated is that is there a
I'll
system
tell you that you make a great point. I'll tell you that modern economics is so powerful, believe it or not, with game theory and with the existing theories that are at the forefront of its development. They're so powerful in their predictive capability, okay, that there was a conjecture put forth by biologists, okay, back in the day. I don't know exactly the day. It was like maybe the 70s, 60s. I don't know exactly. Or maybe it was the 40s. It's sometime in the 20, it was sometime recent, okay, that a biologist put forth a postulate that humans would basically over reproduce. And it was the economists using game theory that were like, no, I don't think so. And because the biologists were just looking from a macro perspective, from an evolutionary perspective at the behavior of a repository of other organisms and their tendency that as they reproduce, much like mold, they just overconsume and die. And so they actually predicted trajectory curves, that implied great cataclysms emerging at the turn of the 21st century. Yeah. And so they actually put money on the line, and the economists won that bet. I think it was $10,000 or something put on the line. I don't remember. You can look it up. It's pretty.
That's awesome. Yeah,
And these were not small. I think one of them was at Stanford or something. These were not like small time. These were not small timers. And so the economists have such capacity, predictive capability. That they can actually. They won bets against the biologists. And that's not to say that biology is separate from economics, rather, because slowly but surely, these disciplines are achieving interdisciplinary coherence, right?
Absolutely.
But it's just a testament to the predictive capabilities that we have with the existent modern theories that we've developed, that they don't lend themselves they really are deeply rooted in game theory, interspersed with cognitive neuroscience, evolutionary psychology, and differential equations based macro and microeconomics emergent from that. And again, the differential equations economics doesn't necessarily have to reduce down to a supply and demand value theory that you would classically study, like I'd say of the wealth of nations, right? Stuff like that. It doesn't. It can also be emergent, literally, from axiomatizations that better comport with just a scientific perspective of like neuroanatomy and behaviorism.
Oh, interesting.
It's not to say that you wouldn't associate, make the association, but there are multiple competing foundations to explain why these systems of differential equations are so powerful in their predictive capabilities.
Huh. Okay. No, that makes sense. So, towards a certain extent, the question is that at some point, if you wait long enough, there will be a sense of, well, not a sense, but new emergent value will come out of the marketplace, or not the marketplace, but of supply and demand, that will change the way that we experience the economy in and of itself, and the way that we can even interact with labor, in a sense that can actually change that said dynamic just on its own. You're kind of saying.
I mean, it's very complicated, and I'd say, like, if we ever achieve interplanetary, even interplanetary travel, economics is already going to have to undergo revision, because if we're in different gravity fields, your labor can't have the same space-time dilation as mine does.
Oh, interesting.
So then there's this weird meta of like going to a high gravity planet or something, and working, and that being equivalent to, on a low gravity planet, more years of labor, and then going there. It'd be like the new meta Mexico thing. We're crossing the border, but this time going to the high gravity planet. There's a lot of weird shit that honestly our systems of equations they're woefully insufficiently equipped to really deal with those complexities. And we're not even thinking about change of reference frames. It's much more complicated than I think people presume to realize. And the problems that exist that really will challenge our species will be so much broader and so much more profound than merely conceptualizations of equity. And that's not to say equity is not profound and substantive, but rather, if we're going to parameterize equity and try to make it more well-defined, one of the first things we grapple with is the distinction between phenotypic variance and adaptations which are species typical, and in which do we ground the notion of equity? Because phenotypic variance is going to make that extremely difficult, but species typicality of adaptations is also going to pose challenges as well. And it's a concern that if phenotypic variance is such that equity turns into opposition and imposition of opportunity cost on one group versus another, just due to the discreteness of matter and energy, we're going to run into problems there. It's like I said, when I say I don't fundamentally know, I think that's the most succinct way I could put it. And I've spent many hours talking to a repository of professors in differential equations based macro and microeconomics, and some of them are societal engineers as well. They're engineers, but they're thinking about societal systems and architectures. And I think the direction is interdisciplinary coherence grounded with mathematical modeling with predictive capability that comports with the other sciences. But it's not to say it's purely a scientific endeavor. I mean, philosophy is in no sense useless. And I'm not trying to espouse any such claim, as much as it's extremely difficult to predict. I don't even know if civilization entropically speaking, is going to last thousands of years. It's extremely difficult to predict. I mean, I like to be optimistic, but every 99.99% of all species which preceded us are now extinct.
That is very true. That is absolutely, and but I think the one thing is that the one thing that we have, which might be,
there's a flip side. There's a flip side. For you to be here, every ancestor that reproduced before you had to have succeeded.
Yes, exactly.
There's a flip side to that, right? There's a way to spin it and interpret it as like the cup is half full. I get what you're saying. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. But not only that, but even our capacity to think about these things, I think,
is phenomenal.
Something that is, as you stated, phenomenal, but not only just phenomenal, but can lead to changes that can be that we can't even foresee.
Yes,
in a sense,
and that's part of the peril which we play with economic systems. Is we are just beginning to understand ourselves from a psychological perspective, rooted in neuroanatomy, rooted in evolutionary psychology. And the reason you'd look to evolutionary psychology, people might wonder, why won't you just look only to cognitive neuroscience and neurological mapping? And the problem with that is it's like you have, this neurochemistry exists, but there's no surrounding topography of how do we get here? Where is it going?
Exactly.
There's no contextualization of a big picture. In the evolutionary psychological perspective allows one to ask questions like, well, why do we see phenotypic variance or expression that we would classify as jealousy, right? And we could think, well, it's a statistical argument. It's not an argument of saying what's in your head. That's foolishness. I mean, we don't know. It's really saying statistically which organisms over thousands and thousands, if not millions of rolls of the dice, were more likely to successfully pass on their genes. Those that engaged in mate guarding behavior to ensure it was actually their genes passed on, or those that didn't. And if you roll the simulations, these behaviors, so the arguments are really not so that's a common misconception people have about evolutionary psychology, is they think of it as like a claim of what you're thinking and how you value. People aren't like, when they look at a girl going, she looks reproductively capable, I can't wait to pass on my genes. Like that's not the argument. Because then it sounds preposterous just on its face. That's not the claim. The claim is really a statistical claim borne out over millions of years about characteristic traits that are really, and that's the difficulty of the subject, is that evolution doesn't have a direction, right? And if you, I guess, what I find ironic, and the reason I kind of began this conversation with the notion of like the materialism, the philosophy of science that Marx used as a mechanism for engagement with these concepts, is because I find it ironic that the more I try to cohere other concepts into Marxism, the harder it becomes. And there's kind of an irony there to me.
Yeah,
because the more I try.
I see what you mean.
And to be emphatically clear, I mean, it's not as simple as capitalism, because capitalism itself, if you notice, requires a sufficiently pseudo-free market. But it's not only capitalism we want. We want regulation at the compromise of a productive efficiency. We don't want to just sit around and let the market do its thing if people are dying in droves. But moreover, it's like, what about phenomena for which there may not be economic incentivation for individual firms or entities to partake in the production of the service or good? That's where we have the government step in.
Right, exactly. And I think that in the end, the thing is that individuals only have not the foresight, but the sight to see only these three, or I shouldn't say three, but these two economic systems, in a sense, the Marxist system and a capitalistic system, and they don't necessarily realize that there's a huge variation of economic systems which are out there and that are all working kind of in tandem in order to, not in order, there's not really an order to it, but there's a sense that there might be something emergent coming from all these type of economic systems working together, and might, who knows in the future what might.
Well, also the problems that we see can be possibly solved through counterintuitive ways. So some societal engineers are looking at like vector value currency functions and observing how that can affect behavior. So think of it like a token system at the arcade where you have different types of tokens for different games. What they see is that if it's a vector valued, meaning an n-dimensional currency system in which only certain goods and services can be traded, and I'm not saying, to be emphatically clear, I'm not saying I'm not pitching this, okay? I'm explaining one thing I've heard of that some societal engineers are really exploring. They're not even necessarily trying to implement or I think you're picking up what I'm putting down. So I'm just going to
of course, I get it.
Is that what certain behaviors, and so like if you need a certain dimension of currency, and to compound that dimension of currency, to say like have housing versus food, what they do observe is that there's less of a tendency of individuals to funnel in too deep, or more of a tendency, depending on which is the case. And if there's more of a tendency, people just go to different dimensions. And if there's less of a tendency, then people just kind of generalize in their currency acquisition. And so it kind of, overall, what it seems to do is it can either exacerbate the skewness of the Pareto distributions that emerge, or it can flatten them. It can level the inequality. And so, but of course, this is only with machine learning programming, and I think there are only like a few primitive studies, so I wouldn't get too excited about it. But
okay, good point.
But it's an example of how counterintuitive changes, can without even changing the existing structure surrounding it, can sometimes have contrary to what we would expect implications. So I think, even though this conversation was kind of directed towards Marxism, the real intent was to kind of motivate the complexity of economic problems. And again, I cannot overemphasize. I would say when you specify it to a very, ironically, material model, and you require of yourself to set up axioms that have predictive and explanatory capability, and then they have to be falsifiable predictions, then you set up experimental mechanisms by which to affirm or refute these predictions to some degree. That's usually a great way to put such theories to the test. But notice, some of them are particular to humans, some of them are not. Some economic principles, and game theoretic principles are not necessarily particular to humans, but a lot of them are. And so it really, you have to define your terms and think about the domain of discourse. And if it's a blanket, because another thing about Marxism that's interesting is this, but you can see how the interdependence of things, what they are to what comprises them to what contains them, is really how Marx thought about these struggles between classes. They were connected like a graft of tissue, one tissue to another, intimately. Right. And so you can see how he kind of, and I think one could be forgiven for seeing these relations, ironically, in his time.
Right.
I really couldn't fault him for that. But also, these behaviors, another problem is they're really motivated. Like, if we look at greed as a potential motivator, and wealth acquisition, and inequality and asymmetry in that inequality, it's sometimes, if you're looking at dopaminergic reward incentive, a person doesn't even necessarily have to conceptualize you as an opportunity cost to emerge as an extreme outlier in the acquisition of a particular resource. There are a repository of different neurochemical and thus behavioral presuppositions that can lead to these externalities. And the reason I'm motivating that is because, like I said, if that's the case, if there are mechanistically, physiologically different motivators, and I mean neurochemically there, right, then even if you instilled Marxism and eventually, I suppose, a kind of communism, for all you know, people may say, back to the previous postulate, there's insufficient economic incentivation, or really dopaminergic incentivation, for some kind of reward structure. Would people persist in the presence of an external stressor, or would they opt out? What I'm trying to say is, if we gave most people the responsibility of being delegates, would they really opt in to be a delegate?
Good point.
Because we don't. A lot of the studies we have on early chimpanzees and bonobos do not seem to comport with those postulates.
No.
You know, we tend to see people in response to externalities of those sorts without adequate. So I guess what I'm saying is it may be that these externalities emerge not only because of the attempts of exploitation, but also to call it exploitation, you know, because again, the idea is that my labor is what's adding value to this thing. But let's say we don't even add labor theory like as the presupposition. Let's just say we look at it from a supply and demand perspective and we say, well, look, you're making a profit. So at the end of the day, you're charging more for this thing than it costs to make. And that means you could make more in the market, and you're taking that cut for yourself. And in that sense, it's a question of like, what is fair? But I think the problem is, ironically, Marx's analysis doesn't contextualize, even if that is a direct and purposeful, you know, air quotes, exploitation, the risk on the part of the entrepreneur, because to own that capital is to also take on more liability for its damage and more responsibility for its maintenance, because not everybody necessarily that will maintain the machine works for your firm, right? There exists some businesses that have operative costs that are external costs to other firms that not only audit them, but, you know, due to regulatory oversight, which again, it's not pure pseudo free market, but that are required to supply them with the very means of production they have. But moreover, I think what's lost here is sometimes having a lot of capital put down is a downside, a serious downside, because it freezes your assets in a sense. If you put down all this capital down into infrastructure, it is extremely hard, depending on the infrastructure, to move that capital. Your assets are frozen.
That is true.
You know, if you're a landlord and you've put all your savings into a house and you watch a tenant destroy that house,
yeah, it's no longer, you cannot use it anymore.
It's not as simple as just I'll sell the house. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not, you know. And
oh shit, that was something that I didn't think about.
Well, it's just, again, it's who is getting the short end of the stick here, because on the one hand, the person with the risk is clearly, there is room for exploitation. Clearly, you know, like when you look at Amazon and you look at the billions of dollars, I mean, you could ask, where is that money going? You know, but then the weird part is, like, I mean, this kind of reminds me of like credit as well, because really, and this is the irony again, is to talk about these kinds of exploitation is to really not think about credit in the system, because most people don't realize this, but most of the currency that exists in fiat money is credit. It's a credit-based system, and it exists in part to minimize the amount of inflation that occurs. You see, because you need if you have a fixed amount of currency as your population grows, we're thinking physical currency rather than the digital for the sake of representation, you're going to have a harder and harder time distributing that currency as the population grows, right?
Right.
There are less dollars per person. So if you have a proportional amount of currency as the population grows, you can decrease the needed amount of currency by actually doing a really interesting trick, which is if there's an asymmetry in the acquisition of currency where one person is just sitting on that money, it's not being recirculated, it's just potential, it could be used for something. It could result in more GDP, more transactions per unit time, which is not necessarily better, but you get what I'm saying. More people can move more things, have more transactions. Well, wouldn't it be interesting if you could get them to take that money and recirculate it by incentivizing investment? And that's kind of the idea of credit. Is credit is not creating more currency. It's this notion that because there will be more currency in the future because of the population, and it needs to be slightly above the proportion to the population, which explains why prices slowly go up over time. But because that's going to occur, then I will give you money. I will create a liability on my part, and you will have debt. And we create in that the notion of credit, which allows for more transactions per unit time without the additional need of additional currency to be created in the system.
Shit.
But the caveat of that system is that is actually one of the integral parts of the boom bust cycle in our economy.
Right.
Because then borrowers, right, are directly linked to the confidence of the people giving them the money. And if they start to run out of money because the supply is starting to get pinched, then lenders are not going to, and then if lenders are not going to be as confident in those investments, then we're going to have a slowing of the economy, right? And so this is how it all ties to the other systems. I'm just referring to the United States, but it should be understood that this notion of I will lend you money, ergo capital, in exchange for return on investment is it exploitative? Because from the perspective of the other person who has no money but is the borrower, without that lending, they could not orchestrate whatever they're doing. And the lending, maybe for a repository of purposes. It could be for the acquisition of food. It could be for the starting of their own business. It's just not emphatically clear to me is, again, what does it mean to be exploited? If we define exploitation to simply mean the number you got at the end of the day was bigger than mine, we're going to run into a repository of counterintuitive problems.
Right. So we need to look a little deeper into what is the sense of exploitation then.
I mean, I agree with you that there is clearly a sense in which, okay, but if you make like $200 billion, but then again, here's the question, okay? How much of that actually needs to be recirculated to function for the economy? How much of that money do people actually need is a question that's often overlooked.
That is true, but I think what a lot of individuals also want to see is that individuals are at least living at their needs in a sense, and not being left out on the street and everything towards that extent. So I think certain people, when they look at equity, for instance, they're not necessarily looking at like not all people being equal, but I think it's towards the extent that all people having a sense of livelihood within the system, even though that in itself is difficult. And how do you do that? But I think that's what people are trying to achieve, is that even if you are making the minimum wage, that there should be some way that you yourself can have a dwelling of some sort, so that you don't need to be
I think part of so when we study specific problems, say the housing market problem, I think it's important to contextualize and carefully analyze things. So it's like in the case of housing problems in the United States, which is not all around the world, so it's this may not be applicable, but part of it is thinking about the logistics of like how we do housing. Because, for example, if housing was more affordable, would minimum wage in the United States need to necessarily increase? And so, when often you have demand but no supply to meet it, ergo there are a repository of consumers, able and willing to pay for cheaper, affordable housing options that do not exist. Well, in most of the situations where this occurs, if you look at the zoning laws, there are laws that prohibit, literally it's illegal in the United States to build certain structures that would comport with these. And unfortunately, due to those laws, the emergent profit incentivations that exist are those that square with single family large households, and this is compounded by a plethora of other things. So part of it is we need to look at the existing laws and see if they comport with economic implications, because the laws are so old that we kind of got ourselves into a bind, kind of like China with the one-child policy.
Right.
We didn't think about the mathematics, and now they're paying the price. In the same sense, so are we, the hounds snapping at our heels. And so it's complicated because on the one hand, one would think that the way to maximize housing, for example, or even better, healthcare. Let's look at healthcare. I think you and I agree. We want as many people to have healthcare as possible.
Of course.
But the way that we are conceptualizing healthcare is really backwards to the foundations of insurance. So insurance is not something you plan. You don't insure something you actually plan to happen. You insure something. So the way it works is you have a liability that is such a huge liability that if it happens to you, there's just no basic practical way you're going to be able to afford it. Like, let's say you hit a Bugatti, you're screwed. Maybe a bad example, but because I don't know if your insurance will cover a Bugatti. I don't know. But what I'm trying to say, right? I mean, if you slammed into a Bugatti and you called your insurance company, I wouldn't blame them for going, you know what, man? I think you played yourself there. But anyway, the idea is if you hit a car and you injure someone and there's like a $50,000 operation at the hospital, the insurance is supposed to basically kick in so that you don't immediately go bankrupt. So then as on your liabilities, you can write that off as a practical liability. So now your financial ability to proceed is independent of that liability, which would be disastrous. And so when you insure your car, you're not insuring it for every nook, every scratch on the car, because the price is calculated based on the probability amplitude of occurrence and the expected cost adjusted for inflation, with maybe some overhead for profit if it's a profit, oriented organization. And so the problem is that the higher the frequency in these cases, the cost is going to blow up astronomically. But if you look at health insurance in the United States in particular, it is conceptualized as health coverage, which means that it's all packaged together as coverage, and you're not insuring things that are not likely to happen. It's flipped upside down, where if you want to get healthcare, rather than allowing a pseudo free market to do work, you can't go into a hospital and say, how much will this cost? They go, we got to talk to the insurance companies. But you see, this is a problem because when you distance the consumer from the hospitals, what happens is, let's say they charge you $800 for a water IV drip, which has happened. Okay. Now, if it was a market for water, what a normal firm would be challenged with is, who are we going to find in abundant enough quantity to charge this unit price, right? But if you charge the insurance, all the insurance has to do, since it's all bundled together in a binary, you get coverage or you don't, is have enough price desensitization on the part of the consumer and a high enough premium that they can point to the hospital to say, oh, don't look at us, it's them, they're charging too much, to mathematically still make a bit of a profit.
Wow.
And then the hospitals can raise revenue and point to the insurance, and the insurance can point to the hospitals, and the consumer is completely out of the loop.
Right, exactly.
And so, but this is down to the foundation axiomatic conceptualization of insurance. It's something that you don't get insured for something you plan to happen. That's completely backwards. The idea is you get insured for something that, if it happens, you cannot cover it. That's why you're opting into paying for this.
Right.
When you get life insurance, you're not planning to die. And that's and if you are, then they're going to usually detect it with forensic science. It's pretty hard to fake these days. But in the same sense, so some of the problems that are attributed to capitalism, like, when you look at the current problems we have in healthcare in the United States, if you look very carefully, it's not even clear that this has any direct relation to the system of capitalism. It's implicitly related, but you notice that part of this is that we are really trying to make the government, like there's a single payer plan where the government is going to be the insurer. Right. The problem is, if insurance is conceptualized as coverage, right, then you can bundle all these things together. And so individual price desensitization can't occur, because now price elasticity of demand is going to be such that the consumer will be very, very less sensitive to price changes than they would be if it was individual things they were paying for, like IV bag drips, etc. And so, because they can bundle it all together as coverage or not, it turns into a binary where people either opt in or they opt out, and they're completely screwed. And the insurance makes bank, and it's that's not sufficiently pseudo free market capitalism, even though, again, it would be, I don't think it's necessarily the best model. But another problem is, in some countries like Scandinavian countries, they have efficient ways to do this, but the issue we run into is, like, if there's high taxation, et cetera, what people forget is those countries have like 5 million people. We have 370 million people. And so some systems that work very well on certain scales. And sometimes mathematically, when you scale up, what works at a small scale, just like in physics, where you can walk on water if you're an insect with adequate surface tension proportional to your mass. But if you scale up, if you have insufficient velocity, et cetera, you're not gonna sit and stand on that water, right? It's just not gonna happen. So it's very complicated. The scale, the parameters, sometimes, in other words, sometimes it's not even a critique of the system. It's something unrelated or implicitly related, but you know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. But the one thing that I'm also looking at too, and this can maybe be for another discussion, because I love this discussion, but I just don't want people to get too tired and stuff like that. So I'm going to end the show at 1:30. I'm sorry, I mean at the 30 mark. But the one thing that I do think of is that even with these small nations, do you think that there might be a solution that are within these small nations, but if you tweak them in a particular way, they might actually be beneficial for large systems, for larger.
And that's the difficulty is like I honestly couldn't just like tell you a lot of the things that you would really want to thoroughly, rigorously map out are going to be. It's going to be a repository of complicated systems of differential equations.
Right.
And it's not going to be a neat little bundle of an answer. There will probably be problems, but I suppose it's unfortunate that the conversation must end so quickly because, I was going to bring in Marxism as it pertains to hospitalization and address how some of the.
If you want, we can go.
It's definitely going to be too long though. It'd be like 20-minute explanation. So what we can already reschedule. That's fine. I don't want to I think you're right. It's been a lot of conjecture, which is to be emphatically clear, because if I wanted to go into the mathematics of every single conjecture submitted herein, we would be in this conversation probably for 4.5 hours, right? It would be
absolutely.
And I'm not sure how many people would follow, but I hope that in case it's not emphatically clear, I do not claim to fundamentally know any of the conjectures that I've submitted herein, but I'm very confident that the answers moving forward, I'm not sure that they're going to be found thinking big picture capitalism or communism or socialism. They're really down to individual problems. What I mean by that is when you have an existent problem, like say as an entrepreneur, while there are general parameters to that problem, sometimes the specificity of what you've engineered or manufactured requires a very precise engineering solution. And so very often I think the system will be more likely something akin to Frankenstein's monster, where some systems of equations scale well and some principles do not. And they may not all comport with a simplistic classification.
Yeah, absolutely. I would completely agree with that. I think that anybody who looks at the two systems or the three systems as some sort of saving grace in a sense, and we need to stay capitalist, or we need to stay Marxist, or we need to stay socialist. I think the idea is that if you're too rigid within your thinking economically, you are bound to fail.
It's a perspective, I think, that would belie a substantive understanding of differential equations based economics, macro and micro, because at the end of the day, any one of these conjectures is going to have a myriad of different rabbit holes that are going to emerge from the analysis conducted and the mathematics done and the studies done based on the mathematics. And it's extreme. Any one of the presuppositions uttered herein, a person could spend an entire lifetime studying and you would only scratch the surface.
That is true. That is absolutely true. And definitely when it comes to systems of equations that are like within the economy in and of itself, where there is no one fix. There is
often people like point to Star Trek, right? But it's like, I'm pretty sure Picard says on many occasions it's his ship. I'm pretty sure he's at the head of the ship. He's the captain. I'm pretty sure there's a chain of command. Even in Star Trek, there's clear inequality. Like Picard is held at a different standard than just crewman number 18.
Right, exactly. But I think the crewman number 18.
Like there's clearly a sociological discrepancy that emerges even in the idealized Star Trek. It's almost like in our attempts to escape our neurology, we discover it.
Absolutely. And wow, that was really profound. But yes, I think that when you really look at it, even in the Star Trek novel, the Star Trek series, what we do see is this indication that prestige is now the new currency.
Yeah.
In a sense. And that in and of itself, and that's why I try to tell people, like you look at these systems of equations within these shows, but then in the end, you don't really realize that you're looking right at the same inequality that you're kind of staring at now. But instead, you're idealizing it because it's different.
I would put it this way. If you call it prestige, if you slap a different label on it, does that change the mathematics of how the equations play out? Does it change who has more? You can change the dimension, but if the emergent equations don't change too much phenomenologically, what have you really accomplished? It's like I'm achievement oriented in my society, and so I have more achievement than this person, and that's why I'm working towards it. And it's like I get these Starfleet credits from the achievement. Sure, but at the end of the day, you have a emergent inequality. Now,
Absolutely.
again, Marxism isn't about per se inequality, and it is about equity. But what's often convenient is equity is nebulously defined.
Exactly. And I think that's what really tarnishes certain systems is ambiguity, where
I think
people say these things that seem to be
I would
so
say
profound.
one, like, and I'm just trying to interject because we're running out of time. I would
Oh
say
no,
one of the
please go jump
best
in.
attempts to like conjecture of or pertaining to equity, insofar as it relates to justice, which are understandably different things, are the attempts put forward by like Rawls when you're thinking about the veil of ignorance, right? But the problem with the veil of ignorance, the idea was like if you didn't know who you would be in the society, if you had anonymity towards yourself, and you're all together in this collective group agreeing on the axioms of your societal structure. The idea Rawls put forward was that a just society and would be one in which people behind the veil of ignorance, and you could think an equitable one perhaps as well, would be one in which they behind the veil of ignorance agreed to the societal structure not knowing where they'd fall in it. The issue is that you're going to fall into the problem of like what kind of better are you, right? Do people suffer from the above average effect? Is there a non-trivial subset of sociopathy or psychopathy such that those top percenters are like, who think highly of themselves, they're like low in conscientiousness. They're going to say, well, of course I'll be in the 1%, and they'll vote accordingly. The problem is what you sneak in the back door of Rawls' attempt, unfortunately, are certain axiomatic assumptions of the kind of betting people do, and unfortunately, empirically, we don't see evidence to predict the kinds of betting quotients that lead to the probability distributions that would comport with Rawls' attempt. But it's a good start.
Oh, absolutely. And I wish that I heard about the Rawls veil of ignorance, but still, I do want to read up on it. I do want to be a little more knowledgeable in it and everything, because as you stated, there is certain aspects within it which is, how could I say it? I wouldn't say beneficial, but I would say that they kind of answers certain questions or belies certain questions that are beneficial in a sense for understanding how a society or an equitable society could be formed in and of itself. But in the end, it is above the time. So, but I do want to give you the final word, though. I do want to give you the final word before we go. So,
I have no final word in this nebulous river through which we sift on the steady stones on which we attempt to stand. I will only motivate what I hope to be questions and encourage people to really rigorously think about what's been discussed. I fundamentally don't know.
likewise. After this conversation, likewise. But in and of itself, it has been a pleasure having you on. And I can't wait to have you on again. And I did ask you well, we'll discuss that behind the scenes. But thank you very much.
You're
For
most
coming
welcome. Next time, hopefully, it'll be with a friendly face rather than just a picture.
on. Exactly. And everybody who is watching this, thank you so much for tuning in. It is greatly appreciated. You are the very thing that helps this show be what it is. And again, thank you so much, Christopher, for coming on. And I will see you all next week on the Atheist Uprising. Thank you so much for coming on through. And it's always been a pleasure. Have a great 1 second. Have a great one.